This is not the Retroid Pocket 6, but it probably could be. Let's navigate this somewhat confusing release, which is the Retroid Pocket G2, and dive into what it is and what it offers. So if you're having deja vu and thinking that this looks like a Retroid Pocket 5, you're not wrong, because it basically is a Retroid Pocket 5 with some new internals, mostly the same thing. Retroid took a Retroid Pocket 5 and shoved a new G2 Gen 2 chip in it, which is actually pretty impressive, spoiler alert, and we'll dive into that later in this video, and kept pretty much everything else the same. What makes this a bit more confusing is that it released at pretty much the same time, at least for pre-orders, as the Retroid Pocket 6 with an 8 Gen 2 processor. So are they that different? Is the performance here as good as an 8 Gen 2? Let's do an overview of the device, look at the performance, and then we'll come back here and recap at the end. So without further ado, let's just jump in and get right to the performance specs and a quick overview of this device. Okay, so what's different about the Retroid Pocket G2 from the Retroid Pocket 5? Well, let's just take a quick overview of the specs. We have the G2 Gen 2 CPU in here, so that's the major upgrade. We've got 8 GB of LPDDR5X, so we do get 5X versus LPDDR4X RAM in this. Same amount of RAM, slight difference in the specs there. Still get the same UFS 3.1 128 GB storage and micro SD card slot. We do have a newer version of Android, Android 15 instead of Android 13. Same 5.5-inch 1080p 60 frames per second AMOLED screen. Same cooling, same battery, same analogs, same Hall sticks. Same Wi-Fi 6, we do get a bump to Bluetooth 5.4 instead of 5.1. Not sure if that's going to matter to you. Maybe if you have some specific headphones that utilize that, then that could be good. But other than that, it's really the same specs-wise. We'll take a quick tour and overview of the device. I'll recap all the same things that I've already said about the Retroid Pocket 5. If you want an in-depth view on that, then go ahead and look at my review video over on the Retro Handhelds channel down in the description. I will say that one major kind of opinion that's changed since I first owned the Retroid Pocket 5 is the ergonomics, and I'll touch on that in just a moment here. So quick tour of the device if you haven't already seen a Retroid Pocket 5. Got our triggers and bumpers on the top, as well as our volume and power button. On the bottom, we've got our TF card slot, which is just a little hatch that you can pop off there, cards inside. A headphone jack and USB-C charging, as well as display, OTG, all that kind of good stuff. On the back of the device, we've got large intake and then our exhaust for the fan, and not much else to speak of there. And of course, on the front, we've got our 5.5-inch AMOLED screen and all of our controls and inputs. Okay, so I'm not going to do my full controls analysis like I do usually, because again, you can go look at my Retroid Pocket 5 video. So I'm just going to do a super quick recap of what is good and what's not good about the Retroid Pocket 5 / Retroid Pocket G2 form factor. First up, it is excellent for D-pad gaming. It's very comfortable to hold here and operate the bumpers, the triggers, your D-pad, and your A, B, X, Y buttons. That is the strong suit of this layout. I will note the same thing that I've already said about the Retroid Pocket 5. Not my favorite thing is that the button noise tends to be a little loud. I don't know if it bothers me as much as it did when I first had the Retroid Pocket 5, and it's certainly not as offensive as the Retroid Pocket Mini, but they do tend to be a little loud and clacky at times. Just depends on how you press them. They're okay, not the standout feature. Love the D-pad, nice and accurate. You can hit what you want to hit and it feels pretty satisfying. There's a subtle click, but it's not loud. The bumpers are too noisy, but clicky bumpers seems to be the standard on devices these days. I guess it's probably just easier to use those micro switches. It's just a bummer that we have to hear that. Triggers are pretty good, but it can be difficult to push them depending on how you hold the device. Where it starts to fall apart a little bit more is joystick usage. You have to find a creative way to hold it. If you grip it like this, like you would for the D-pad, then this is super not comfortable because your thumbs will get super tired after a while. So you got to hold it out a bit more, or you got to support it with like your fingers down here or pinkies. And there is a TPU grip that helps out that will be a lot more comfortable for the joysticks, but I personally don't love having to have a separate grip device when I take my device out and about. So yes, joysticks can be a little bit more challenging. So if you are going to buy this to play some Switch games that do use more joystick controls, just keep in mind that the placement of the joysticks isn't always optimal, especially if it's a twin stick game. I also found in a racing game where you use the triggers, you can't hold it like this because nothing braces pushing down the triggers. You really have to support it with your fingers or some way to keep it from slipping, and then it can just be a bit of a challenge to hold. So ergonomics of the Retroid Pocket 5/G2 platform are great for D-pad gaming, and they're just kind of like a grade C for dual joystick gaming. Again, that's just going to depend on your personal preferences. You know, we do keep a very compact and slim profile on here, so that's nice. It's enough of me griping about the ergonomics of this device. I eventually sold my Retroid Pocket 5 when I first had that because the ergonomics weren't my favorite, and some devices I appreciated a bit more. But this is still a really cool form factor and package, all other things considered. So I've shown you the device. I've talked about a brief overview of how the controls and everything feel. You know, the screen, it's amazing. It's AMOLED, it's brightly saturated. It gets bright enough. It's not an issue whatsoever, and everything just looks good on this screen. I really don't have anything bad to say about the screen on this device. Audio quality, well,
at 6x, which is 4K internal rendering resolution, versus the 4 Pro being at 3x for 1080p. Literally pushing.
I don't recall my voice sounding quite that nasally in mid-range in person, but you never know. Yeah, the speakers are just passable. They're not great, but you know, they provide you with sound. And of course you've got an actual headphone jack on this, so it's not too big of a deal if you are a headphones user. So, you know, that's good to see. You don't have to worry about Bluetooth audio latency or anything like that. So the screen is great, audio is okay, controls are good depending on how you play it. Let's jump into the performance testing, because that's what we're really here for today, to find out, what is this about? Is this worth it over the Retroid Pocket 5? Is this basically a Retroid Pocket 6? I don't know. Let's look at the performance and then we'll sum it up afterwards. I'm gonna start out on Gamecube, then I'm gonna do some PlayStation 2, and then finally some Switch. And I'm gonna make some notes based on previous reviews that I did on this device. If you haven't already watched those, you can check those out. I'll put the links down in the description. The first video is a Retroid Pocket 4 Pro versus Retroid Pocket 5, which was one of my first videos on this channel, as well as I'll link down below another channel, Retro Handhelds. I actually did a few videos with them before starting my own channel. And I've got a Retroid Pocket 5 review that I will link as well. So if you want to see how this compares to those, you can go check out those videos. But today we're going to focus on the Retroid Pocket G2. So without further ado, let's boot up Gamecube and take a look at the performance there. Okay, so right off the bat here, I'm going to start with Kirby Air Ride because I checked this out in my previous videos. On my comparison video between the Retroid Pocket 5 and the 4 Pro, 5x was the peak performance that I could get out of the Retroid Pocket 5. So I've just gone ahead and whacked this up all the way to the 6x internal graphics settings on Dolphin, and I'll prove that here just by showing you. We'll go to our enhancements, our internal resolution. You can see here 6x native, which is the maximum you can set Gamecube to. And let's just see if it can perform at this level. Yeah, and here you go. So that's running at pretty much 6x without any issue. And I don't really have much else to say about that other than it maxes out the performance on Gamecube for this game. So let's just go ahead and move on to the next game. Okay, so one thing I wanted to say real quick before I dive into this and take a quick break away is that all of this is gratuitous resolution. You only need 3x resolution to max out 1080p on Gamecube on the Retroid Pocket 5 or the G6 or the 4 Pro for that matter. So this is all just to show the performance differential. This is going to run the entire Gamecube catalog pretty much, unless there's a couple games with particular issues, at 1080p 3x without issues. So, and the Retroid Pocket 5 could essentially do that as well. So it's not really like that important that this can run Gamecube better. It's just to show kind of the performance differential here, and if maybe there's a few games that you want to like output to a 4K TV and upscale or something like that. So anyways, jumping back over here, when I checked this out in my comparison video previously, it was barely 4x in Time Splitters 2 on the Retroid Pocket 5. And right here, I've got it at 6x, and it says that we're at a max of 300%, although you can see here a slight slowdown. So realistically, not quite 6x. So let's go ahead and change that to 5x and see what that looks like. And yes, now here at 5x, the device has absolutely no problem chewing through this. So we do see that difference from 4x to 5x. So we did get a little slowdown there. I forgot how to play this freaking game. So yeah, again, this is more resolution than needed, but as you can see here, 5x, we are handling the game pretty much with no issues. There might be a couple dips here and there, but this is an increase over the 4x that we could get on the Retroid Pocket 5 for Gamecube. Anyways, let's continue moving forward as I don't want to spend too much time on Gamecube. Okay, so the final title we're going to look at on Gamecube is Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 4. When I did my comparison video, I was running this at about 4x on the Retroid Pocket 5. I did bump it up to 5x, but I had some occasional dips. So I'm on 5x right now on the G2, and we'll just see how that stacks up comparatively. And I am now playing at 5x pretty much without any dips, so there's some improvement there. So let's go ahead and turn this up to 6x and see what that looks like. Again, 4K, gratuitous resolution, more than this display needs, but if you wanted to dock it to a TV, maybe you'd want to push 4K, I don't know. And yeah, there are some slowdowns, although largely it is running at 4K. You know, some shader caching here and there, perhaps that's causing those stutters. It's definitely within the realm of playable. And Tony Hawk's 4 is not necessarily the easiest GameCube to run that I have in my testing catalog here, which is why I like to include it, because it does have some stutters sometimes. But yeah, overall, it's pretty much playing around the same level of stutters at 6x as the Retroid Pocket 5 had at 5x. Again, this is more than you need, but that just goes to show the performance here. So let's move up the tiers of performance onto something more demanding and take a look at PlayStation 2 now. Okay, so the first PlayStation 2 game I'm going to check out today is Gran Turismo 4. When I did my Retroid Pocket 5 comparison, I was at about 4x, was slightly too much. There was some dips at 4x on the Retroid Pocket 5, so let's start there on PS2 and see what that looks like. As you can see here, initially, no problems. One of the more challenging parts of the track where you go under these lights in the trees here, dipped down to like 57, but that is pretty minor. The majority of this track, we are running at 60 frames per second at 4x, which is a better showing than the Retroid Pocket 5 was. So let's actually bump it up another notch and see what that looks like. So we're gonna go over to our graphics settings. We're gonna pick a 5x native, which is 4K for PlayStation 2, and see how that runs. And yes, we do see a bit of struggle there. This is a lot of pixels to push. We're running at like 50 frames per second. So yeah, 5x on Gran Turismo 4, but of course, I would just play it at maybe 3 or 4x because those are already more than you need for this game. So yes, this is what, 3x, 2.5x? I mean, you could just put this at 3x, play at 1080p with no dips whatsoever in Gran Turismo 4. So that's slightly better than the Retroid Pocket 5 did. So let's move on to the next game, which is going to be Shadow of the Colossus. All right, so here we are at the first Colossus where the graphic demands start to be a little bit more than just kind of running around earlier. And as you can see here, we are pretty much maintaining this 30 frames per second target, which is better than the Retroid Pocket 5 was doing. So let's go ahead and turn up the resolution scaling and see what that looks like. So here we are on a 4x native setting, and it appears that we are mostly maintaining performance target, though there are some performance dips here and there when he like slams the ground and stuff like that. So it looks like we do have a modest improvement here in PlayStation 2. We essentially went from having dips on 3x to more solid 3x performance in Shadow of the Colossus. Again, a bit more demanding of a game. Let's go ahead and jump up to the final PlayStation 2 game I'm going to test today, which is God of War 2. So in God of War 2, what I had determined previously on the Retroid Pocket 5 was that 2.5x was the performance ceiling, and at 3x it started to slow down. And we're basically seeing a 1x increase here. So we are now at 3.5x for God of War 2, and it starts to slow down a little bit at 4x. So as you can see here, at 3.5 times resolution, it's having no issue chugging along at 60 frames per second here. And all the tests today are in the high performance mode just to show maximum performance capabilities. So let's go ahead and just double check our resolution here. And the graphic settings are, sorry, they're at 3x. Let's bump it up to 3.5x just to prove that I am not making stuff up. And yes, here at 3.5x, we are still running just fine. Of course, we only need 3x to have perfectly sharp visuals here. This is again, just a demonstration of how much performance we can get out of this. Let's bump it up one more notch to 4x and see what starts to happen. And yeah, we're dancing right around that 58, 53, 51. Yeah, we're starting to see slowdowns at 80 to 90% speed, although a good chunk of 100% speed. But again, there's not really any reason to run at this resolution. That just goes to show that where the performance is at here. So we go from 2.5x on the Retroid Pocket 5 to 3.5x on the Retroid Pocket G2, which is a nice modest improvement. So as you can see, for GameCube and PlayStation 2, we are seeing some pretty modest improvements, about a 1x scaling multiplier, which isn't linear. It gets more and more processing power required to push more and more pixels on the device. But yes, again, the Retroid Pocket 5 was pretty much already there for full catalog GameCube and PS2 for the most part, depending on the settings you chose. But the Retroid Pocket G2 certainly has extra insurance. If you were going to stop at PS2, would I get the G2 over the RP5? If the RP5 was cheaper, then no. But if the G2 is within spitting distance of the price that you're going to pay, then probably worth it just to get the extra headroom there. So let's move on to something, again, a bit more demanding and test out some Nintendo Switch real quick. All right, so here I'm in the latest version of the Eden emulator, and I'm currently using Turnip 2600R2, which I believe when I first got this device was the most recent version. There may be a slightly newer version, but that's what I did my initial testing on, so I'm just gonna stick there for now and show you what that looks like. I am at docked mode on here, so let's just boot up Hades and see how that runs. So here at docked mode, which means 1080p resolution, although the Switch, I believe, does some downscaling to handle it, so it looks kind of bad if you do handheld mode. But anyways, here at docked mode, we are getting, yes, a lovely solid 60 frames per second with no problem on Hades. You know, I don't have testing data for the Retroid Pocket 5 in front of me right now, but I'm not sure that it was able to maintain a smooth 60 on Hades 2. If it was, I'm sure you guys will let me know in the comments that I'm wrong and that I was lazy for not doing my research. But yes, unfortunately, I don't have a Retroid Pocket 5 on hand at the current moment to do a direct comparison. But as you can see here, for this, you know, kind of middle of the road Switch title, you know, not a AAA, but also not a 2D game, we are seeing pretty excellent performance on Hades 2 at dock. We are at 1080p, docked, 60 frames per second, nice and smooth as butter. This is pretty awesome right now. So let's play something else and see how we continue to fare with Super Mario Brothers Wonder. And yeah, as you can see here, we are getting a nice smooth as butter 60 frames per second here on Super Mario Wonder. And that is pretty excellent to see. I mean, the G2, I think, really takes us up a notch from the Retroid Pocket 5 being able to run most Switch, some Switch with tweaks, some Switch not so much, to just a much broader range of compatibility and performance out of the G2. So, you know, my title for this video, I say this is not the Retroid Pocket 6, but it's like, you know, it almost could be. Like, it's not new looking, but performance-wise, we are doing quite well. And I mean, I think we're even competitive with Snapdragon 8 Gen 2 performance on this device. In fact, let's boot up a game that actually gave me some trouble on 8 Gen 2 and see what that looks like on this device. So what's interesting here with Super Mario Odyssey is that I tested this out actually on the Ayaneo Pocket Evo, which is the G3X Gen 2, which is essentially an 8 Gen 2 with an overclocked GPU. So in theory, more powerful than an 8 Gen 2. And I struggled, unless I was really maxing out the performance on the fans of that, to hit 60 frames per second at 1080p in Super Mario Odyssey. And here we're pretty much hitting it. Now there are some audio latency issues here and there, depending on shaders loading when I am at dock 1080p mode here. But if I knock it down to 720p handheld, those mostly go away. I did try playing around with the different audio backends on Eden and had some mixed results there. So there may be a better combination of drivers or audio settings to get rid of those stutters and play at a smooth 60, but the point still stands that this is really impressive performance out of this trip. So audio smoothness aside, this is really, really impressive what we're seeing out of the Retroid Pocket G2 here. A game that flagship Ayaneo Pocket Evo performance struggled to hit 60 frames per second on, and we're hitting that here at a much cooler and quieter profile too, mind you. I've got this device on high performance mode with the fan on, which I can barely hear. I don't know if you can even hear that at all, and because I've got it on smart mode right now, high performance, and yeah, it's barely ramping up at all. Like, this chip is staying pretty cool while I'm doing these demanding tests. The Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom here, which is, notoriously a difficult game to run via emulation, particularly on Android. And let's actually see how that fares here on the Retroid Pocket G2. So starting off here, I am in handheld mode, and we'll see what that looks like. Now, there are a lot of shaders that have to compile in various areas on Tears of the Kingdom, so sometimes you're not gonna have an optimal performance immediately, but once you've been around that area, we do see some pretty good stuff. So let's take a look at what that looks like. Some of these shaders may have already been built from the last time I loaded this area. As you can see, we've got a little bit of initial stutter, the fan's ramping up. So let's just give this a moment to build the shaders, and then we can see, what that looks like. There are some issues with this graphics driver where you'll occasionally see these little black squares, and there are probably other driver versions to optimize that. I didn't spend hours and hours testing every driver. I've heard that there are some older versions that may perform a little bit better there. Again, that's just going to take lots of testing and tweaking to figure that out. But I digress. If you take a look here at our frame rate, we are at 30, and this is, this is smooth. Once the shaders have loaded, and I'm doing my stuff here as Link, like it's pretty impressive. And this is, the outside area that would be more demanding. It's not just the intro. And yeah, we're running, I'm impressed that we can see this out of the G2. So in fact, let's actually switch this over to docked and see how well that does or does not run. Okay, so check this out. We are at 1080p docked mode. Tears of the Kingdom, 30 frames per second. Yes, there will be slowdowns and stutters with shader caching, but I have tested other Android devices that are pretty high performance that have struggled to accomplish this. So yes, the Retroid Pocket G2 has some pretty impressive power underneath the hood. So if you were planning on doing a lot of Switch 3D title emulation on your handheld, and you were considering the Retroid Pocket 5 too, then the Retroid Pocket G2 is absolutely a must-buy upgrade, assuming that you like everything else about the device, because it is really such a great performance profile. And in fact, we've got these colors like the turquoise and yellow on the G2, which make it look even more like a Switch Lite. So this truly is kind of like a Switch Lite Pro. We got a 5.5-inch OLED, we got lots of performance, possibly run some games better than the Switch did even, depending on which games they are, driver compatibilities notwithstanding. But yes, this is pretty impressive, So let's go ahead and we're gonna wrap up this performance section now and just kind of give my final thoughts on the G2, who it's for, whether you should buy it, and wrap this up. Okay, so we've looked at the performance of this and found out that it's actually pretty impressive and perhaps almost on par with the 8 Gen 2 in real world tests. Why did Retroid release this for pre-order at the same time as the Retroid Pocket 6? There's not a whole lot of differences between the two. The Retroid Pocket 6 has more of this kind of Vita shape versus the slightly more rectangular shape of the Retroid Pocket 5 and G2, and it has a configurable top or bottom joystick. We can choose between either. In fact, it wasn't originally like that, but based on feedback from the community, Retroid decided to give people the option of top joystick or not. What makes it more confusing is when we look at prices. The launch price of this is $219, so only $20 more than the currently discounted price of the Retroid Pocket 5. So if you're between this and the Retroid Pocket 5, just spend the extra $20 for the performance. Unless you're getting a Retroid Pocket 5 on the used market for a significant discount, in which case it could still make sense, especially if you're not planning on playing Switch or Windows and you only want to play PS2, Gamecube, and below, then that's perfectly acceptable and plenty of power for those systems. If you do want to dabble in Switch and maybe some Windows stuff, spend the extra $20 for the G2. It's kind of a no-brainer. Retroid could probably almost just discontinue and only sell the remaining stock of the Retroid Pocket 5 and replace it with the G2, and that would be fine. So why would you pick the Retroid Pocket 6? In fact, what's really confusing is the base model, 8128 of the Retroid Pocket 6, is $10 cheaper than the G2, but you get 120 hertz screen, same size screen, but 120 hertz and the option for joystick top for $10 less. So if you're targeting the 8GB RAM variant and you want to play games that have a lot of joystick, then you should probably order the Retroid Pocket 6. I'm holding a Vita here, but this is my stand-in for the Retroid Pocket 6, okay? Just pretend this is an RP6 that I don't have yet. So order the Retroid Pocket 6 for the base model and save $10 and potentially have better ergonomics. Now, again, this is all I'm just guessing based on what it looks like that the ergonomics will be better for joystick on the Retroid Pocket 6. When you step up to the higher tier model of the RP6 is where it gets a little more confusing. It's $260 for that. which is 12 gigs of RAM and 256 gigs of storage, which is going to be a better value proposition for Windows emulation. You might need that extra RAM, and you definitely need that extra internal storage space, you know, a faster storage than an SD card for the Windows games. Sometimes running them off SD is a suboptimal experience. So in that case, the 260 might make more sense to wait around for the Retroid Pocket 6. But you also have to consider that when you start approaching that $300 price point, you could be jumping up to the AYN Odin 3, which is going to give you the 8 Elite chipset, which is potentially going to be way better at Windows emulation. Maybe not a big difference for Switch because of the lack of driver support, but maybe more future-proof. You get a half-inch more screen. You get 6-inch 1080p, 120 hertz. You know, we've already seen that screen in the Thor here. So, you know, as a stand-in, and that is a beautiful screen, you know, just for a size comparison of what that 5-inch looks like versus the 6-inch, you can see the 6-inch has a noticeable amount more of real estate. And so we can kind of expect that out of the Odin 3. But that does start at $300 and go up to maybe $400 or so. Sorry, it starts at $330 and goes up to $400 if you want 12 gigabytes of RAM. So at that point, then it's $140 more than the Retroid Pocket 6, and that is a big difference. If you want to be future-proof, you like to have a big library of games, you want more internal storage, you want to do a heavy Windows emulation in the future, then the Odin 3 might be the way to go there. But, you know, staying in Retroid Pocket 6 here is probably the way to go. You just kind of want to dabble in that and you don't really want to break the bank. We have so many options for handhelds right now that it's kind of ridiculous. Retroid Pocket 5, G2, Retroid Pocket 6, Odin 3, Thor. Which one do you get? It's really going to come down to personal preference. What form factor do you like? Do you prefer a top joystick? Do you need that extra performance? What's your budget? So many considerations there. What do you guys think? What do you think is worth buying? Do you think that the G2 is a worthy release? Are you mad that it's basically a Retroid Pocket 5 Plus? You know, is this the 3 Plus situation all over again? Same price, but better performance a year later? I don't know. You could be mad about that, but you could also not be mad because they're releasing better stuff and you still have the option of both. I don't know. As a Retroid Pocket 6, do you think that form factor is going to be way better? Does the 120 hertz screen matter to you? I honestly don't know. It's sort of overwhelming out of handhelds there are out right now. Personally, I'm going to go Odin 3 or Thor because I like a bigger screen and I want that 6-inch screen and I can afford to spend a little bit more on one of those. I do have an Odin 3 Max on pre-order, still waiting for that to ship out. I think, what is that, next month at this point? But I don't know. What a time to be a retro gamer. Retroid gamer? Retro gamer, even. So yeah, here's the G2. It's powerful. It's better than the Retroid Pocket 5 in pretty much every way, and which is only a couple ways. And you can buy it now. That's really all I've got to say about that. Until next time, I'm Based Eric, and this is the Retroid Pocket G2. Was that stupid?